folks. How's everyone doing today?
Good, thanks.
Fantastic, great. Guess we're about to start. Thanks for coming to our workshop. My name is Torres. I'm a campaign worker with Hands Off Appalachia, based in Knoxville.
Hello, I'm Lindsay. I'm based in Lexington, Kentucky. I am a graduate student, a PhD student in geography at UK, and I research land tenure in Ecuador and then Appalachia. I also do some work with the Hands Off Appalachia campaign.
Cool. Yeah, so let's go ahead and start. So Hands Off Appalachia is it's an urban campaign based in Knoxville, and that we're all city folks and there's folks who work within the coal fields, right? So there's two different types of work happening there. And so what we do is we target the financing of mountaintop renewable, specifically UBS, which is an international bank that is based out of Switzerland. They're one of the top funders of mountaintop renewable.
Can you speak up? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
When we move forward.
UBS is one of the top funders of mountaintop removal in the world. They do stuff in Australia, the Powder River Basin, and they're a top funder in Central Appalachia. It's interesting. Yeah, so different folks do different kind of work in our movement. So some folks do direct action, some people do like lobbying or legislation or regulation. So all these different types of work happening in the movement to end mountaintop removal. And then our campaign specifically targets the financing of mountaintop removal, because even if everything else fails, if companies can't afford to do it, then they can't do it, right? And it's a really capital-intensive project. Because it's you blow off the top of a mountain and push it to the valleys on the side. It's a lot of equipment. There's just a lot of regulation. So it costs a lot of money to do mountaintop removal. So that's the kind of work we do. There are other different campaigns that are targeting the financing of mountaintop removal. So this graphic tells you just different banks and then different stuff and how much they funded mountaintop removal. So this is from 2009 to 2010. There's PNC. They did $3 billion that year. We have some great folks in Philly working with them. Equate, Earthquake Action Team. There's Citibank, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and then UBS up here with $1.4 billion in 2009. It's a pretty substantial amount of money. The reason we went with UBS was that there are so many of them in East Tennessee and in the South, and no one was targeting them. So no one had really kind of featured them as part of their campaign. And so it just made sense for us to start building them. Yeah, so UBS has financial relationships with 4 of the top 9 MTR companies. And so those include Arch Coal, which recently bought International Coal Group, and they're pretty large. And so there's some of the stuff they've given them, $50 million, $7.5 million. So there's Alpha Natural Resources. UBS actually oversaw the merger of Alpha Natural Resources and Massey, creating like the largest MTR company. So that's pretty big deal. A lot of work is we're thinking about kind of deepening into that, because UBS didn't fund Alpha Natural Resources last year, but they still did create the largest MTR company. And Massey, they had some of the worst, breaking regulations and like labor conditions and environmental. It's just incredible. It's one of the worst companies in the history. Everything, right? And then when Alpha bought them, all that kind of washed away, right? Like, even though it was a lot of the same folks, a lot of the same equipment, same sites, and all that. So that's kind of a big deal. And like Alpha didn't have any, like they had like 1 or 2 active surface mines in West Virginia, and then they bought Massey, and then they went up to dozens. And so yeah, so that's a big piece. So even though they're not being funded currently, it's still a big part of our campaign. And then James River Coal, and so they're one of the smaller out of the top coal companies, but we still figure into them a good bit. They do a lot of stuff in Kentucky, and so they're also not really targeted a lot, and so it's, so our campaign stands out that way also. And then Patriot Coal, so they were funding them, and so that's actually kind of given us a lot more to work with in that. Yeah, so a lot of us who started the campaign we come from community work. Right? So I did rural development work with folks in Alabama and East Tennessee, and other folks have been doing similar type of work in the South and throughout Appalachia. And so, like recognizing what it is, like well, mining employs people, right? And so we're not against miners, we're against mountaintop removal. And so we're an anti-MTR campaign, not necessarily underground mining, which is it employs more folks and is more often unionized than MTR. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the thing about Patriot is Patriot was created by Peabody Energy, which there's no UBS relationship there, and Arch Coal, essentially to offload miner pensions. So they created this company and then sold off all their least profitable complexes to this entity, Patriot Coal, which least profitable being the ones with a really good retirement, healthcare packages and all that. And so eventually it went bankrupt, and they're like, well, we don't have any obligation to, we're not under obligation to carry through any of our promises there. And so that left thousands of miners without their, so yeah. And so that's a part of our campaign. And just recently, so here, they went bankrupt, right? But a few days ago, so actually earlier in the summer, they reached a settlement with Peabody, and just with Patriot, and then a few days ago they reached one with Peabody. And now there's talk of directing the UNWA and Fairness to Patriot organizations working to address this issue. They're now thinking about targeting Arch Coal. And so there's a lot how our campaign lines up with a lot of the work happening around this issue. Cool. And we'll start from there. Some of the folks we work with, an MTR site in Virginia. Yeah, so we've had pretty big successes in some ways. So early on in the campaign, because we're approaching the second year of Hands Off Appalachia, we had some international press, which is pretty awesome. And so there's this really cool thing, right? And there's this picture of a mountain being blown up, and UBS is all over it, right?
Where is Schweiz out of?
What's that?
Where is Schweiz out of?
It's a German paper. It's like the leading German newspaper.
Is it a newspaper or a magazine?
I've been told it's a newspaper, but it looks like a magazine. Right. And so that's a pretty big deal. Like, the UBS doesn't really care about what our press and our media and the people in the U.S. have to say about UBS's policies towards MTR. But they, as this big international financial institution, they really care about what the international community, particularly Northern Europe, what they have to say about UBS. And so, like, their image is really important to them. And so that felt pretty good, being able to associate them with that practice in such a high-profile way. So yeah, after it ran in this magazine, there was like a segment on Swiss, like the national television, and they ran like a 6-7 minute segment on UBS's funding of mountaintop removal. And so both of those things had quotes from our folks and folks in the region, so that was really good. The reason they found that, they were just looking at our YouTube page and saw it, and they're like, this is ridiculous, and then contacted us, and here we are. Cool. And so the campaign we do a lot of different things, but the majority of our work is based around a lot of research. So we do a lot of our own research and work with other organizations. So our research supports other work, and people share work with us. And then there's also, we kind of organize in different parts. So we kind of built in East Tennessee, and then throughout Appalachia, and now we're building the northeast leg of our campaign, and that's pretty exciting because we're kind of aiming to start building internationally. So things are moving along pretty well there. So we do research and organizing, and then a lot of actions and direct actions. And so here's like a wave that we did earlier this year. I can just run through some pictures here, some of our folks. Yeah, we do a lot of street theater, we do a lot of our own art builds and that kind of stuff, and that's really exciting. I'm trying to find one with our anchor. We have a big 7-foot puppet. Yeah, and so we do a lot of theater with UBS's symbol, right? Like the way they perceive themselves, we have a lot of fun with that. And they really, really, really don't like it. Repurposing their logo, like their image, like their language, everything, to associate them with NTR. Really exciting. So part of the work we've been doing is trying to associate this big, like amorphous thing called UBS that's somewhere in the world, right? It's a Swiss wealth management bank, right? But it's not really Swiss. there's just a lot of activity and a lot of power and relationships and money just kind of floating up here, and then over here there's MTR, and then a lot of stuff in between, right? And it's really hard to make that connection between those two things, and then community members, and then framing our work around that has been a little difficult, right? So we've been moving towards that a lot, towards addressing that. And so here's a quote from one of the folks we worked with, who's a retired coal miner, or a former coal miner, who lives in Kentucky right now. His name's Nick Mullins. Y'all might know him as a thoughtful coal miner. Pretty awesome dude. But yeah, so he did some work with us in Kentucky, one of our best friends, and he said, the people of Switzerland wouldn't stand for U.S. banks funding the destruction of the Alps, so why should we allow them to fund the destruction of our mountains? Yeah, and so that brings us to Stamford, Connecticut. This is one of those ways we're bridging this gap between all this stuff happening over here and then the destruction that Appalachia sees every day. And so UBS America's headquarters is in Stamford, Connecticut, and it is the home of, so it's like the largest employer in Stamford, Connecticut, right? And it is also home to Philip Lofts, who is the UBS Group Risk Chief Operating Officer. And he is the guy who oversees the funding of extraction in North and South America. That includes Central Appalachia. It's like such a volatile issue, and UBS is sensitive enough about like the activity around their funding that there's like one person makes that decision. So anytime anyone wants to finance that kind of industry, it has to go to this guy, and this guy gives them the yes or no. And so Stanford is very, we're drawn to Stanford for a lot of reasons. And so, so we recently did an action earlier this summer, I guess it was June, where 4 of our folks up there blocked the entrance to the UBS headquarters there. It was building off of an action we did in Knoxville where 3 of our folks and our puppet, our big 7-foot puppet, locked themselves to the UBS office in Knoxville. So we did a few high-profile actions this summer, and this is the one at Stamford, Connecticut. And so so this is where we really started building the northeast chunk of our work. We're going to be going back at the end of the year, in a few weeks, and building locally with organizers there and bringing our folks to the region, so we can develop a sustained campaign in Connecticut at the home of UBS Americas. So cool. This is my little chunk.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is sort of go back and put a lot of this within the framework of the history of unequal land ownership in Appalachia. A lot of people may sort of already know this history, so I won't dwell on it too much. But I think if we're going to talk about big structural issues like finance, we should also be talking about land ownership and land speculation. And so after going through some of the historical framework, we'll discuss a little bit more how all of these things between finance, mountaintop removal, and land ownership converge in the case of Blair Mountain. Just to clarify, land tenure patterns were established in Appalachia prior to industrialization. So Gaventa kind of did a summary of a lot of research that was done on Appalachian land ownership in his 1995 piece on the political economy of land ownership in Appalachia. And he pointed out that in 1860, nearly 60% of all Appalachian households were already landless. So the divide in land ownership is not really a new phenomenon. This dates back even to before the coal industry was really well established. But it's part of what facilitated the establishment of the coal industry. Dunaway points out that land provided the economic basis for the structuring of a polarized Appalachian society in which the wealthy landed gentry amassed a majority of the acreage, while more than half the settler households remained landless. So there's a long legacy of class-based divides around land in this region. Part of that relates to the tidewater planters and their role in land speculation since even before the 1763 British Proclamation line. The British Proclamation line, as you can see, it's like the dark reddish area. It separates like the red from the pink, and it's along the watershed of the Appalachian Mountains. And so basically the British Proclamation said, you can't settle west of that line. The Tidewater planters were the wealthy southern plantation owners who were growing things like rice and cotton and tobacco. There was the southern slave owners like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. They had actually been speculating west of that line since before the 1730s. Land titling conflicts actually started in the 18th century. The colonial states were issuing land titles on Indian lands to land speculators before cessions had been agreed to. Land companies were going and negotiating their own treaties, getting illegal acquisitions. So you have like the Transylvania Company, which had 20 million acres of land in Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee. The Ohio Company of Virginia, the Loyal Company, the Greenbrier Company. These are some of the big land companies that were established in the 19th century and even earlier. And oftentimes the heads of companies were even appointed as state boundary commissioners. So there is a long alliance between land administration and large land holdings. So by the time a lot of the land had been acquired by these wealthy landowners, by merchant capitalists, by the Tidewater planters and their affiliates, by the time that the Homestead Act came around. So sort of the Appalachian frontier, as many of you probably know, was a myth. This land ownership pattern was already established. And the Homesteader Act didn't help the immigrant families who were coming at that time. So like by the turn of the 19th century. And this is just a table from Wilma Dunaway's book that shows you from 1790 to 1810, the percentage of absentee landowners in Appalachia was already very, very high. And you can see the highest numbers are in Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. Okay, and so many of you probably know about the land ownership study that was done in 1981, and it basically showed that these patterns persisted. They still persist today. There's a follow-up study, I think, being organized now to see what the status is today. But at least in 1981, and we'll probably see some similar things today, we may even see more concentration today because of the advent of fracking. But in any case, so 40% of all land and 70% of all mineral holdings in Appalachia were corporately held by 1981. And the top the 50 top landholders all engaged in extractive activities like coal, oil and gas, timber, steel, and other metals. So this is a land ownership model. It's an economic model that's premised on extracting wealth from Appalachia for external profit. And so, if we don't focus more on who owns the land, this may be common knowledge in certain circles, but it doesn't always come into our campaigns. And so, when someone else owns the land, then they can blow up the mountains, they can bury our streams, and they can say that it's good for jobs, but we know that it's really only good for profits. This is the famous picture of Lyndon Johnson coming to Martin County, Kentucky. This was in Time magazine in 1964 to declare the war on poverty. And we can't begin to think about poverty in Appalachia unless we talk about the dynamics of land ownership and wealth. And so in 2009, of course, we still have a large percentage of Appalachian counties considered distressed. That's the red blocks that you see on the map.
I'm sorry, can you go back one? Oh, I see.
So this is from the Appalachian Regional Commission, which is the same group that funded the land ownership study in 1981.
Cool. So what does that mean for the work we do? It means a lot. So earlier this year in spring, it was March, Rainforest Action Network put out their coal risk update, and specifically Arch Coal, and then like their intent to mine the Blair Mountain Battlefield in West Virginia, and then looking at that, and also their human rights commitments. And so after we saw that, we're like, well, we really, that's something we have to do, right? That's where our campaign has to go. We do a lot of friends in that area. a lot of our background is in like cultural and heritage preservation, and so it just makes sense to do this. And Arch Coal is one of the coal companies that UBS funds. And so for the past few months, we've been working with folks in that area to see how our campaigns can line up and support each other. And so just a little update, just a little heads up. So the Battle of Blair Mountain is like the largest civil uprising in the U.S. since the Civil War. It was 5 days and 10,000 coal miners and against 3,000 strike breakers, and 1 million rounds were fired in those 5 days, which is insane, right? And it's one of the most important like labor events in the history of labor, right? And so it was all these miners attempting to help to unionize other counties in the area, and then they were met with resistance from the coal companies there, and then the private security that they hired, and eventually the National Guard was sent in to break this up, right? And so a lot of really good labor protections came out of this. So it's a really important story. Well, fast forward to today. Let's see. Yeah, so this site, you can just walk onto there and find all this stuff, right? And so this is from our friends in on Blair Mountain, the Blair Mountain Heritage Alliance. So it's just pictures of some of the stuff they had in their museum earlier this year. So some rounds fired. Here's a picture of the miners holding a bomb that was dropped on them during the Battle of Blair Mountain, so they didn't go off. But yeah, it was a lot of, it's a really big part of American labor and Appalachian history. Now, UBS is facilitating its destruction. So what that looks like is, so a lot of the mountain has already been strip mined, and so on that mountain there's different coal companies with Alpha and Arch Coal both mined there. And now they're trying to extend into the actual, within the site itself, instead of just the area surrounding it. And so because it's a good historical place, what they're trying to do is, so it was previously on the Registry of Historic Places, and then it was taken off a few years ago. There's a lot of controversy over that. And then, there's a really big dispute about that too, because the coal companies had this like concerted effort to they just mail people forms and ask them to sign it, and they're like, this is because you need a certain amount of people in the area, like the majority of the people living in that site, you need their consent for it to be declared as a historical property. And so they had this big campaign to get folks against this, and so despite that, they still didn't have the majority, and what ended up, so even though they didn't have the majority, and a lot of the people that they had who signed in, like a lot of them were property owners, a lot of them were people who were supposed to be dead, and so beyond that, they still didn't have the majority, but regardless, they took it off the registry. So that, and now they're trying to, so this is one of the main permits there. This is essentially you stop the Atkins Fork surface mining, you say Blair Mountain. And so to expand into the actual historic site, what they have to do is, because it was previously on the Registry of Places, they have to go through this process called Section 106, so like the National Historic Preservation Act, which means that any place that was previously on the registry or is on the registry or qualify for it, they have to go through this process, and if APIEL give permission to do it, and then in that process, consultants participate and then give input. And so the people who are applying to this are Arch Coal, Alpha Natural Resources, and Western Pocahontas Properties, which is a land management and land leasing company that does specifically extraction. Like 30% of the metallurgical coal produced in the U.S. comes from their properties. I mean, they're pretty big. I mean, they're one of the largest landowners. They used to be one of the largest landowners in East Tennessee, in Campbell and Clayton County, until 10 years ago. But Western Pocahontas Properties is a subsidiary of NRP, Natural Resource Partners, which was created about a decade ago, a little more, when Arch and a bunch of other companies sold a bunch of their land to this company to create this entity. And so there's a pretty close relationship between Arch Coal and Alpha Natural Resources in this company. So even though UBS doesn't directly fund them, there's been some relationship. It's not that big of a leap. And so we've kind of been including them in our campaign recently. And Arch and Alpha are two of its top lessees. So there's the programmatic agreement that the Corps put out to get folks to participate in this process. So you see the applicants, Western Pocahontas Properties, Aracoma, and Mingo Logan. So, yeah, so some of the other work happening that folks are doing in West Virginia around Blair Mountain are incorporating like a human rights framework as a tool to kind of push back on this, right? And so so it's like the usual stuff, right? It's like rights to air and water and like public health issues. But one of the things that a lot of people have been doing because of the Blair Mountain stuff is, and particularly that cold risk report from Rainforest Action Network, is they've been looking at the United Nations Human Rights Framework and expanding it to include like a right to history and a right to place. And so they've been incorporating a lot of issues around displacement and land ownership, and particularly with Blair, like a right to history, cultural preservation. Because what's happening, this is erasure, right? And like, if this isn't a concerted effort, it's pretty close to wipe all this away. There's already been like decades of fights and disputes around this, right? Against like who's telling the story of Blair Mountain, what does it mean? And so that's a lot of the work that they're doing, and we're kind of helping out with that. So yeah, I guess just pass it over to you.
Tom mentioned Natural Resources Partners. They own the whole eastern half of Blair Mountain, I believe. So bringing it back to sort of the land ownership framework, I'm going to give you a little information about NRP. So they specifically own and manage mineral properties, and they own large swaths of land throughout Appalachia. They're a Houston-based property company, and as Tom mentioned, they also own Western Pocahontas Properties. This slide here is from their presentation at the last UBS Mini Coal Conference. So these companies come and solicit financing, and they try to show why they're a good investment. So these slides are directly from NRP and their presentation to UBS for financing of their various minerals projects. Not that they run the projects, they lease lands to mining companies. So they lease reserves to experienced mine operators under long-term leases in exchange for royalty payments. And they're publicly owned, they're traded on the NYSE. This is their overview. So they state that they're the 5th largest owner of coal reserves in the U.S. They have about 2.3 billion tons of reserves. And they're strategically located in Appalachia, Illinois, in the western U.S. And they're very proud of the fact that they have basically no direct operating costs or risks. So they're really nothing more than a land speculating company.
Yeah. So what does that mean for our campaign? It means a lot. Yeah. So when you're talking about like extraction and all this stuff that's happening, I'm just going to pull this wonderful little map, I guess. Yeah. So like there's the big trends happening in Appalachia, right? Like decline of coal and the increase in natural gas. And so a lot of what's happening is because we're winning, right? But what is a win? And a win is like great, like UBS stopped funding MTR, right? But what if they fund something else? Or what if they stop funding MTR in Appalachia and they move somewhere else? And that's kind of the case that's happening now. And so there's kind of been decline of coal, and companies getting really desperate and pushing for even more controversial places in Appalachia. But then there's also been the rise in like financing and doing natural gas projects, particularly all along the coast. And so my work up until before I started working on this campaign was all in Alabama, and so like a lot of just wonderful Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi folks, and like that's such a big part of the work they do. And like there's this huge disconnect that I've seen between like the movement, like that movement and this movement. And so like UBS, like they put out a statement early on in their campaign that says that like talking about their commitment to sustainability and all this other stuff, and that's a big, beautiful green Swiss company, right? And that they don't give financing to any company whose majority of their income comes from mountaintop removal. But there isn't any company whose majority comes from mountaintop removal. And so anybody could say that, but it looks like a good thing, it looks like a win, but it's not really on the ground. And so we've been kind of having a lot of questions internally as a campaign about what that means, particularly around so like looking at other extractive industries, because we're anti-MTR, but what about, we're talking about natural gas, or maybe there's a labor issue, maybe more environmental stuff. And so we've been, instead of seeing it as a challenge, we've kind of taken it as an opportunity to expand the scope of our work and our allies, and the space to do a lot of really, really great solidarity work. And so we're really pushing that forward, particularly around a lot of really exciting labor stuff that's happening right now in our campaign, and also with the stuff happening with Blair Mountain. So this is just some of our campaign propaganda. There's a Blair Mountain here, Lingo Logan, one of the companies there, it's Arch Coal. And so UPS wants Arch Coal, Arch wants a Blair Mountain for the coal. And so that's a big focus of our campaign right now. Just kind of questioning like what our campaign is doing and what is a win for us. So like looking beyond just this one extraction thing, right? And seeing like it's just like the public face of this deeper thing, these relationships and power around land and extraction and money. And Mount Top Removal is just one part of that piece. Cool. Questions, comments, concerns?
Just going back to that map that you were showing, what are they doing in Louisiana?
Recently, NRP announced a big push that they were redirecting a lot of their energy and money towards the coast and towards oil and gas. And so I imagine that's a lot of what's happening right there. But this right here is just talking about Louisiana's lit up, but it's not. It's a state in which NRP generates coal royalty revenues. So, but a lot of that happening down there is a lot of oil and gas that they're gearing up towards.
How much work are you doing to organize or get media attention in Switzerland?
That is a very good question, thank you. So there are three pieces of our campaign, right? Three big projects. We're doing all sorts of stuff, but the three really big things is some really cool labor stuff that will, so that's happening. The Blair Mountain work, and then building the northeast leg of our campaign in Connecticut with our allies in Rhode Island and New York, Connecticut, of course. And so all three of those things we're like talking about, really putting that Switzerland face to UBS here in the country, and like developing, organizing around UBS there in Connecticut, incorporating the labor and human rights and historic preservation work through Blair Mountain and the labor work we're doing, and using that as a platform to build our international campaign. And so we've got friends overseas, and so we're exploring those relations right now. We're looking to see what that looks like. And so some of the stuff that we're talking about is we're working with some folks who do a lot of climate work, climate justice work overseas, other folks that do shareholder activism. That's something that has been pretty successful for our friends like Equate, the Quick Reaction Team. And so there are folks that specifically target UBS, and UBS recently, Park Forward Brown from West Virginia, he toured Europe and went to different banks like Royal Bank of Scotland, UBS, and then gave presentations on mountaintop removal, what it means when these banks fund this, to their shareholders, right? And so that's given us a lot of space. And recently he was with us in Connecticut 3 weeks ago, and him and one of our campaign workers presented at Yale and at Wesleyan. And so so that's really what all this activity right now is. We're putting that together so we can start building internationally. So this kind of work is going to help build that. So is that good? Awesome. Yes.
What do y'all want to come out of this? I mean, I'm aware that it's a divestment campaign. Is there another element to this campaign that is like, instead, when you divest, then reinvest in another type or another? I mean, I personally, I think Yins have done an awesome job getting it to the point where it has, using arts and all where it is, but where do you want to go with it? How do you see that happening?
So I'm really glad you brought that up. So when we were building in Lexington, in Kentucky this summer, part of the language that...
and you're going to have to pitch up just a little bit, please.
So when we were building our campaign in Lexington this summer, part of the way they saw that work is they pushed that language of not only divesting from funding mountaintop removal, but reinvesting in Appalachia. And so that tied a lot to a lot of stuff happening in the region, but particularly in Kentucky. And so KFTC, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, that's a big part of their campaign, is reinvest in Appalachia's bright future. Appalachia has a brighter future, and it looks like this. And so because of that, we've been having a lot of conversations around that. And it's actually kind of split now, what that looks like when, because it's such a winnable thing, UBS fully funding of mountaintop removal. It's enough, if I checked it right now, and we got a statement from it, it wouldn't surprise me if it was 6 months, it's there. And so now we're having these conversations about what do you do after that? And so the conversations are kind of on two sides. Some folks are looking at, like, great, we'll just expand to other types of extraction, right, or in other areas, right, the regions. Because there's a lot of the work has been really good at kind of, pushing that message forward. And then the other half, really having some serious conversations about kind of seeing a split between community work we've been used to doing, community folks and residents, like development work and that kind of stuff, youth leadership, and then the resistance work that we're doing through Mount Justice and hands-off Appalachia. And so particularly in West Virginia, like with the folks who we're talking to that do work with Blair Mountain, the Blair Mountain Heritage Alliance, the stuff that they're interested in doing is actually a little outside of the realm of what we have been doing. So they're like kind of supporting museum efforts, a lot of narrative collection, yeah, so that's kind of where we are. Like, some of us want to expand the campaign to other types of extraction, and other folks want to, focus more on the community development approach.
And to tie to that, are any of the others in the network focused, is there a relationship to water qualities? And I'm stretching, but I'm thinking that to walk into something, our mountains produce 80% of the world's potable, tasteable, drinkable, living water. Is there a way to tie what you're doing to the healthy restoration of the mountains as a watershed? Meanwhile, we get lots of other benefits also.
Mm-hmm.
So the commonality would be water quality, restoration, land restoration. Are any of the groups in your network doing anything with that? I'm looking at 50 years down the road, not 10 years down the road,
Yeah,
by the way.
so as a campaign, I can't speak for the entire campaign, but personally, I'm super into really good water quality. So it's not too far outside of what we do. But there's no one specifically working on water quality in the campaign. But there are wonderful folks in our movement that do. And some of them work with us too within the campaign. But so like the ACE project and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think having that conversation is going to give us more space to look at other projects. But
I'm wondering, I came in kind of late, are you focusing on particular coal regions, trying to get them to divest from particularly maybe capped coal, or are you just trying to divest from all coal, looking at the western regions also?
Well, originally the work, yeah, so it started doing Central Appalachia, but we've kind of expanded, like, well, it isn't unique here, it happens all over the world, right? And so we've kind of moved away, but it's still, our work was started in Appalachia, is part of, that's like the movement, right? But recently there's been a lot of solidarity work happening in our movement with folks out west, and so we've been having some conversations with folks in Texas and Utah, to do some interesting solidarity work with them, even though they're super not in Appalachia. And right now we're having conversations about potentially Australia and that kind of stuff. And so our campaign is grounded within Appalachia, but I think it'd be really short-sighted of us to only specifically look at that and say no more MTR or no more UBS MTR in Appalachia is a win. If UBS is still doing it everywhere else.
Well, to tie into that, what I was thinking is TVA has come out, they're not using Central Appalachian coal except in one power plant now. They're phasing out, but they're moving into the Illinois Basin. So that's where your work is going to have to move a little bit, and the Wyoming Powder River Basin. So I was just wondering how that was fomenting your work, so to speak.
Yeah, Arch actively mines in the Powder River Basin, and so that's our heads are kind of thinking about that pretty because we'll be doing some stuff up in that area soon, I think, maybe. But yeah, so like kind of going back to a lot of what Lindsay talked about is it isn't just MTR, it's these relationships, and these relationships are doing things all over, and it manifests in different ways. And so, Yeah, so that's what we kind of hope folks come away from. It isn't just MTR, it isn't MTR in Appalachia. It's just these deeper, powerful relationships between people who have money, people who have land, and people who want fund extraction, right? Or people who do extraction. So, everyone speak to them.
I mean, I think part of what this campaign does and why I think it's so cool is that the traditional way of combating mountaintop removal has really been around permitting struggles. A lot of it has been, and so it's sort of moving. That's still a really important part of the landscape of contesting MTR, but we have to look at these bigger frameworks like finance and land ownership. And that's a big question mark about how you do that. And some of the stuff Carol's raising is one entryway. Yeah.
Pardon this tangential question, which you may or may not be up to answering, but you mentioned Blair several times. To those of us from the outside, it's gotten pretty damn confusing where it stands now. Do you know the current status of negotiations pertaining to the Blair battlefield?
Yeah, so Atkins Corp permit's still there, but a lot of the energy there is being directed towards mining the active site. And so right now, it is kind of up in the air. So different organizations applied to be part of the Section 106 process, part of the National Historic Preservation Act. And so we saw like three companies that applied for that were Arch, Alpha, and NRP. And so the organizations that applied to consult to that, the United Mine Workers of America, Blair Mountain Heritage Alliance, Friends of Blair Mountain, different like state cultural and history organizations. And right now, like they haven't even heard back whether they're accepted as consultants. And so it's going to be a long road. But yeah, they said it's kind of a slow process, is what we've heard from our folks in West Virginia. So we're all, pins and needles until we hear something about that particular process.
But then the bulk of the battlefield, for now, lacking a better term, remains pristine, even though they're been nibbling around the edges for some time.
No, it's not. It's been impacted in different ways. I mean, recently there's been like folks visiting and being like, oh, hey, like this has been clearly destroyed. This thing wasn't immediate, and there's been a lot of controversy over that recently. And so technically they're not supposed to be within the sites, but it's already being impacted. And yeah, and speak to more of their work too, like the Blair Mountain Heritage Alliance and a lot of folks in West Virginia and Appalachia. So like they're also part of this thing called, they're in this process, a mediation process with a group in San Francisco called the Accountability Council. And who's kind of mediating conversation between those first folks on Blair Mountain, and now they've brought in other allies in the region. So they're having mediation talks between folks in Appalachia and a bank in Boston to get them to stop funding MTR. So they're doing all sorts of stuff. They're really, the other thing they're working on right now is they're looking into starting a new museum, because they recently closed the physical museum they had before, and so now there's a new group trying to put it in a different county. So that's some of the work that they're doing there.
Do you know if Brandon's back in Blair full time now?
No, he just went to California a month, 3 weeks ago.
He's
He'll be
still
there.
bi-coastal, so to speak.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
No
That was
problem.
informative.
Cool, anything else?